Imagine a war fought not with bullets, but with paint. A battle waged with rubber tanks, wooden cannons, and sound effects so real that even Nazi scouts believed an entire division was marching toward them. In 1944, a secret U.S. Army unit did the impossible. They didn't destroy cities. They built illusions. They didn't kill the enemy. They deceived them. For decades, their mission was hidden in classified files. No medals, no parades, not even a mention in history books. But without them, thousands of real soldiers might never have come home. This is the true story of the Ghost Army, the artists, designers, and dreamers who fooled Hitler. Chapter 1. The Art of Deception. War has always been about destruction. Tanks, bombs, and bodies left behind. But what if, for once, it could be about illusion instead? In the early 1940s, as the world burned, a small group inside the U.S. Army began to ask an unthinkable question. Could art save lives? The idea was born in the shadow of defeat. German blitzkriegs had crushed Europe. Allied soldiers were dying by the thousands. The enemy had strength, precision, and speed, but the Allies still had one thing Hitler never understood: imagination. At Fort Meade, Maryland, an unlikely plan began to take shape, not among generals or spies, but among painters, sculptors, sound engineers, and set designers. Men who had once built stage plays and fashion exhibitions were now asked to stage something far deadlier: an entire fake army. Their task was simple in theory, but impossible in practice: to create the illusion of power where there was none, to make the Germans believe in divisions that didn't exist, to move phantom tanks across Europe and make the enemy see, hear, and fear them. It was deception as defense, camouflage as a weapon. Among the first recruits were artists from the Philadelphia Museum School and Pratt Institute. They were illustrators, photographers, and architects, men more comfortable with sketchbooks than rifles. But their orders were clear: learn the language of war, and then manipulate it. They studied shadows, perspective, and distance, how sunlight hit metal, how tire tracks looked after rain, how sound carried across valleys. Every detail mattered because their battlefield would be one of perception. Soon, the U.S. Army gave their experiment a name: the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Officially, they didn't exist. Unofficially, they would become one of the most creative units in military history. As generals planned invasions, the artists planned performances. Every brushstroke, every fake tank, every sound would be part of a masterpiece of deception. The war would be their canvas, and their greatest creation would be belief itself. Chapter 2. From Paintbrush to Battlefield. The orders came quietly, almost like an invitation to a strange exhibition. Report to Fort Belvoir. Bring your sketchbooks. The young artists who arrived didn't look like soldiers. Some wore tailored jackets instead of uniforms. Others still carried charcoal-stained fingers. They came from New York, Chicago, Boston, painters, sculptors, sound engineers, and ad designers who once dreamed of galleries, not gunfire. But now they were part of something far more surreal, a secret mission where their art would decide who lived and who died. Their tools were unconventional: rubber, canvas, wood, paint, and microphones. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops became a mobile illusion factory. Their mission: to pretend to be an entire army division wherever real troops weren't. Their first experiments began in the American countryside. In empty fields, they inflated rubber tanks the size of trucks, light enough to lift by hand, yet so realistic that from the air they looked ready for battle. They built fake artillery from telephone poles, strung fake barbed wire, and drove jeeps in circles to mimic division movement. It was theater, but with the highest stakes imaginable. To make it believable, they needed more than visuals. So they started painting camouflage by day and sketching blueprints of deception by night. They studied how German reconnaissance planes captured photos, how shadows betrayed lies, and how movement could turn illusion into reality. One officer recalled, "We weren't hiding. We were showing off. Our goal was to be seen." They learned to make noise, the sound of engines, the clatter of tanks, the chaos of a division on the move. Engineers from Bell Labs began working with them, wiring trucks with enormous speakers that could blast pre-recorded battle sounds for miles. It was art meeting technology, and the results were mesmerizing. From above, reconnaissance planes saw what looked like an entire armored division forming overnight. From the ground, locals swore they saw hundreds of tanks moving through the mist. In truth, there were maybe 40 men, actors on the grandest stage the world had ever seen. Their commanders watched in disbelief. Could deception really replace destruction? There was only one way to find out. In 1944, the Ghost Army received its first real assignment. They were heading to Europe, and this time their illusions would have to survive under fire. Chapter 3. The Sound of War. When the Ghost Army arrived in Europe, they discovered that silence could kill, but sound could save. Their mission wasn't just to be seen, it was to be heard. If the Germans believed they were facing an entire armored division, it wouldn't matter that the tanks were rubber or the soldiers few. The illusion had to breathe, move, and roar. The sound crews, mostly engineers and radio technicians, carried with them a secret weapon: massive loudspeaker trucks. Inside them were wire recorders with hours of pre-mixed battle sounds, tank engines idling, artillery loading, trucks shifting gears, boots crunching on gravel, even soldiers yelling orders in the distance. The recordings had been made months earlier at Fort Knox. Each reel was precisely engineered. A Sherman tank moving at 10 miles per hour, a column of trucks approaching, the echo of cannons from 2 miles away. The sound engineers, now soldiers, learned to blend these layers like musicians conducting an orchestra of chaos. They could project a full armored division across a valley, complete with direction, distance, and depth. When the system was tested, the results were astonishing. Even trained Allied officers listening from afar couldn't tell it was fake. Soon, this became standard for the Ghost Army. Before every major deception, the artists would build the set, the rubber tanks, fake encampments, wooden artillery, and then the sound engineers would bring it to life. At night, their speakers would echo through the forests of France, bouncing off hills and rivers. To a German scout, it sounded like thousands of men mobilizing. Meanwhile, a smaller team handled the psychological side, the voice of the army that didn't exist. These were the radio tricksters, masters of imitation. They studied real divisions' radio habits, their slang, their rhythm, their silence. Then they mimicked them perfectly, transmitting on open frequencies to make German intelligence think the divisions had moved elsewhere. Every copy was carefully crafted. They faked supply requests, troop reports, even complaints about weather. The enemy listened and believed. The Ghost Army wasn't fighting with bullets. They were fighting with imagination, frequency, and fear. Their battlefield was the mind. And as one veteran later said, "Our guns were made of rubber, our voices of wire, and our courage of sheer bluff." Their next act would test every ounce of that courage, because soon they'd be sent to France, right into the line of fire. Chapter 4. The Great Illusion. Summer 1944. France was burning, and the Allies were pushing east. But with every victory came a new danger. The Germans were desperate, unpredictable, and still lethal. Somewhere near Normandy, a new order reached the Ghost Army. They were to hold the German army in place without firing a single bullet. It was madness and genius at the same time. The real 6th Armored Division had been reassigned north, leaving a wide, vulnerable gap in the Allied line. If the Germans discovered it, they could push through and devastate the Allied advance. So the Ghost Army was sent to make them believe the 6th was still there. They had 3 days to build an army out of nothing. On a patch of farmland outside the town of Rennes, trucks rolled in, carrying not tanks, but air. Rubber tanks, to be exact. They were inflated with portable compressors rising from the grass like strange balloons of war. From a distance, they looked perfect, the right size, the right shape, even the right shadows. But the men knew that one sniper round could expose them all. So they painted bullet holes, dirt streaks, and oil stains to sell the illusion. They placed tire tracks with wooden rollers and aligned fake artillery in mathematically precise formations. When the sun fell, the lighting team went to work. They placed spotlights under camouflage nets, adjusted the glow to mimic vehicle fires, and even simulated the shimmer of welding torches. To any German pilot flying overhead, it looked alive, an army resting before dawn. Meanwhile, the sound engineers wired the fields with hidden speakers, looping the hum of engines, the clank of metal, the distant chatter of troops. And in nearby forests, radio teams filled the airwaves with fake chatter, orders, reports, coordinates. To the enemy, it was undeniable. An American division was encamped and ready for battle. Then came the real test. One foggy morning, German artillery began to fire. Shells exploded across the field, and one by one, the Ghost Army's rubber tanks collapsed. Men dove for cover behind air-filled trucks. The explosions echoed, the ground shook, and for a few terrifying minutes, the illusion was literally deflating. But the Germans, seeing smoke and movement, believed they were hitting real armor. They hesitated to advance, and that hesitation, just a few crucial hours, bought the Allies time to move reinforcements into place. The operation was a success. A fake army had held back a real one. As one soldier later said, "It was the strangest feeling, watching our lies protect someone's truth." The illusion had worked, but the Ghost Army knew the danger was far from over. Their next act would take them closer to death than ever before. The operation at Brest. Chapter 5. Operation Brest and Beyond. By the time the Ghost Army reached the outskirts of Brest, France, the war had changed. And so had they. The laughter, the sketches, the jokes about acting in the world's most dangerous theater had faded. Now, the deceptions were no longer practice. They were survival. Brest was one of the last Nazi strongholds on the Atlantic coast, a fortress city bristling with heavy artillery and surrounded by minefields. The Allies needed to surround it, to keep German reinforcements from escaping or counterattacking. And the Ghost Army's job was simple: make the enemy think they were being attacked from every direction. Under gray skies and constant drizzle, the artist-turned-to-soldiers began building their deadliest illusion yet. Inflatable Sherman tanks lined muddy fields. Fake artillery positions were painted on camouflage nets stretched across wooden frames. They even laid down fake tire tracks leading toward non-existent supply depots. To the eye, it looked convincing, but what made it real was the sound. Massive loudspeakers hidden behind hedgerows thundered with the noise of moving columns, explosions, and shouted commands. The Ghost Army piped in sounds of heavy machinery, cranes, tank treads, trucks grinding through mud, and mixed in fake radio chatter describing reinforcements arriving from the south. It worked. German reconnaissance intercepted the chatter and believed the U.S. Army was surrounding Brest with 2 full armored divisions. In truth, fewer than 1,000 ghost soldiers were there. But deception always had a cost. When German artillery began to return fire, it was indiscriminate and devastating. Rubber tanks melted under the heat of explosions. Sound trucks were destroyed. And for the first time, the Ghost Army suffered real casualties. Private Arthur Shillstone, one of the unit's illustrators, later recalled watching a friend die beside a decoy tank. "We fooled the Germans," he said, "but we couldn't fool death. The illusion had drawn the fire, and that was the point." While the Germans targeted the fake division, the real Allied troops advanced elsewhere, breaking the siege from another side. It was a strange, grim calculus to lure the enemy's bullets with lies, knowing some of your own might fall with them. By the time Brest finally surrendered, the Ghost Army's illusion had saved thousands. But the men knew their secret war wasn't over. Their next mission would take them across France and into Germany itself, into a landscape of ruins, frost, and fading morale. It would also test the limits of deception and the humanity of those who lived by it. Chapter 6. When Art Met Death. Winter, 1944. The wind off the Rhine was knife-sharp, and the fields of France were nothing but mud, smoke, and silence. The Ghost Army was tired. Their illusions had fooled the Germans again and again, but each act carried a heavier cost. They had begun as artists, but now they were ghosts in more ways than one. Their latest mission placed them on the front line near Metz, an exposed stretch of land that even the regular troops avoided. The orders were familiar. Set up a fake division, draw fire, hold position. But this time, the enemy was closer than ever. The artists worked in near darkness, inflating tanks under the cover of night. Every hiss of the air pumps felt like a scream in the stillness. By dawn, a vast illusion stood before the Germans. Dozens of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces gleaming faintly in the frost. From a distance, it was perfect. Too perfect. Within hours, German scouts spotted the formation and opened fire. Explosions ripped through the field, shattering the still morning. The men ran between their creations, trying to save what they could, repairing bullet holes in rubber with tape, realigning shadows, reinflating life-sized lies. One of the trucks carrying the sound equipment took a direct hit. The blast echoed for miles, scattering shreds of canvas and twisted metal across the snow. When the smoke cleared, a few of the artists lay motionless among their fake tanks. Their illusion had worked. The Germans believed the battle was real, but the cost was written in blood. That night, those who survived gathered in silence. No music, no laughter. Only the steady hiss of deflating rubber like the last breaths of their fallen friends. They began to question the morality of what they were doing. Was it still art? Or was it manipulation, a dangerous theater built on death? Some wrote in journals, others painted small sketches on ration paper. Empty roads, crumpled tanks, the faces of those they'd lost. And yet, they kept going. Because their illusions were saving thousands of real soldiers. Every day they survived meant another Allied unit could move safely through France, another town liberated, another step toward ending the war. One sergeant later said, "We fought a war with lies, but we lied for the truth." By the spring of 1945, the Ghost Army had pulled off more than 20 major deception operations, from Normandy to the Rhine. But even as the Allies pushed into Germany, their existence remained unspoken. No headlines, no credit, just another shadow behind the spotlight of history. The artists had turned the battlefield into their masterpiece, but history would never sign their names. Chapter 7. The Secret That Stayed Hidden. When the war ended, Europe exhaled, cities in ruins, soldiers going home, flags rising over shattered streets. But for the men of the Ghost Army, there was no parade, no medals, not even a whisper of acknowledgement. Their war had been invisible, and so was their victory. As others celebrated, they were told one final order: "You will not speak of this." Every sketch, every photo, every piece of equipment confiscated. Their unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was erased from official records. Even their families were told nothing. For decades, their story remained buried in classified archives. The men returned home as civilians. Some went back to art, others to advertising, engineering, photography. To their neighbors, they were just ordinary veterans. But at night, some of them would dream of tanks that weighed nothing, of speakers that roared through the night, of their friends who died protecting a lie. In letters that were never sent, they wrote of pride and guilt. Pride in the lives they saved, guilt in the secrecy that followed. They had fought a war not to be remembered, but to make others believe in something that wasn't real. Time moved on. The Cold War came and went. New wars began and ended. And still, no one spoke of them. Their children grew up never knowing that their fathers had once created entire armies from thin air. Their names faded from existence. Their drawings gathered dust in attics. Then, in the 1990s, a historian stumbled across a box of forgotten military records. Inside were photographs of rubber tanks, fake camps, and strange sketches labeled Visual Deception Unit. It was the first clue to a story too extraordinary to be fiction. The Ghost Army had been real. Soon, journalists began to dig deeper. Old men in retirement homes started receiving letters asking, "Were you part of the 23rd?" And slowly, after 50 years of silence, the truth began to surface. One veteran, tears in his eyes, said, "We never wanted fame. We just wanted someone to know we existed." Their secret war, waged with paint, wire, and courage, was finally stepping out of the shadows. Chapter 8. Recognition at Last. When the curtain finally lifted, the world was astonished. For half a century, the Ghost Army had been nothing more than a rumor, a story too strange to be true. But in the late 1990s, the truth broke through like sunlight after a long storm. Declassified documents revealed everything: the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the fake divisions, the sound trucks, the rubber tanks, all of it real. Television crews rushed to interview the surviving members, most now gray-haired, their hands trembling not from fear, but from age. They opened old sketchbooks filled with pencil drawings of camps, tanks, and soldiers that had never existed. Each page was both a confession and a memorial. One man, a former fashion designer, held up a faded photograph of himself beside a decoy tank and said softly, "We didn't fight to kill. We fought to protect. That's what makes me proud." Another veteran laughed through tears. "Imagine spending your whole life keeping a secret like that, even from your wife." In 2013, the U.S. Army finally acknowledged the Ghost Army's service. Their courage, creativity, and sacrifice were recognized as vital to the Allied victory in Europe. They were awarded a unit citation, followed years later by the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States can give. At the ceremony, the surviving veterans sat in the front row, their medals glinting under soft light. Some wore hearing aids, others leaned on canes. But when the citation was read aloud, for using imagination and courage to save countless lives during World War II, every man stood tall. The applause was long and thunderous, but behind the smiles there was something quieter, relief, not for the honor, but for being remembered. After decades of silence, their story had finally found its voice, and as one of them whispered to a reporter afterward, "Art won a war once. I hope people never forget that their work had vanished after every mission, deflated, packed, and left behind. But the idea they carried, that creativity could defeat chaos, would never disappear. The Ghost Army had proven that the mind can be just as powerful as the machine, and that even in war, imagination is a weapon, and mercy, a victory." Epilogue: The War of Imagination. Long after the guns went silent, the illusions of the Ghost Army still lingered, not on the battlefields, but in the minds of those who remembered them. The soldiers who once painted shadows across Europe grew old, their hands now too frail to hold a brush or a camera. But the same hands that once shaped lies to save lives had changed the nature of war forever. They had proven something extraordinary, that art could protect life, that imagination could stand where armies could not. In museums and archives today, you can still see fragments of their work. Torn sketches of fake tanks, faded blueprints marked "confidential," reels of static-filled recordings that once echoed through the forests of France. To most, they look like relics. But to those who know the story, they are something far greater, the fingerprints of courage. The Ghost Army never built monuments or statues. Their legacy was silence, their battlefield made of smoke and canvas. And yet, what they built endures, not in stone, but in memory. Because what they fought for wasn't land or glory. It was the possibility that creativity could triumph over destruction, that deception, when used to save, could become an act of grace. One of the last surviving members once said, "We painted tanks instead of killing people." If that's not a victory, I don't know what is. As the light fades on the century that defined them, their story reminds us that the greatest strength of humanity is not its weapons, but its imagination. The war they fought was one of illusions, but the peace they inspired was very real. And in that fragile space between truth and art, the light of human creativity never died. Thank you for watching. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you have a story to share about these heroes, or someone else from the war years. After this moment, you'll see the names of the men of the Ghost Army, artists, engineers, and dreamers who turned imagination into a weapon and saved countless lives without firing a single bullet. They painted shadows instead of blood and built illusions that helped end a real war. Stay healthy, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments below. Because every time we remember, their art, their courage, and their light live on.